How do I decide as a Christian to obey the government or not if they are doing something unconstitutional? Now, there's a lot kind of in there that maybe needs to be unpacked, but what do you say in this question, Steve?
Let's do Romans 13.
Okay.
So in that passage it says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. And so we have there's another passage in 1 Peter in chapter 2 that says pretty much the same thing, talking about being subject to ruling authorities. And so that's pretty clear. One of the things that's not clear with a lot of Americans is the difference between Roman government or Jewish government or whatever kingdom you have in those days versus our government.
Right.
And so in Roman government, you had specific men that were in charge of you, and it was a despotism. It was a tyranny, in the classic sense of the word. And so you can have nice tyrants and you can have mean tyrants.
Sure.
And so, but there was a man that you were subject to, and that's the case with us also when you're talking about police officers or when you're talking about government officials and that kind of thing. But our government officials are bound by law, and the law that they're bound by is the Constitution of the United States. And so there is no man who's king in the United States. Constitution is king. And so we are bound not to a specific man, but to the Constitution. And so if we're going to take this in the way that it's meant, the governing authority is the Constitution of the United States. And so anybody who is going against the Constitution is a lawbreaker. So they're breaking the law. Okay. Now back to your question. If they're doing something unconstitutional, when do you decide to step up and resist that whole thing? Well, we have a responsibility to do that because we're citizens of the United States and we're subject to the Constitution. So that's the way that it's supposed to work. If we had a monarchy, we would be bound to be loyal to the monarchy because that's the person that God set above us, and so we need to not be undercutting the monarchy. But even in English law, by the time, for example, that you get to the Revolutionary War, the monarch was subject to law, and so there are places that they can't go. There are things that they can't do,
right?
And according to the rules, again, ours is different because we're a constitutional republic.
Okay, so can I just interrupt for a minute?
Yeah.
Why do you think so many Americans fail to understand that? Because if you go back, the guys who set this up realized what you just said, that a king, which of course King George of Great Britain and their controversy with him is how this whole thing started. Mm-hmm. But if you actually know how the Constitution was set up, they open their Bibles and, legislative, executive, judicial are from Bible verses.
Right, yeah.
And so they're trying to set up a split of separation of powers, and they put in there, to your point, that if the government goes rogue, it is the duty of the citizens to usurp the tyranny or the government you have in front of you and institute new government as the people see fit.
Right.
And then, so you have all that, and then the normal American goes, oh, Romans 13, you have to submit to
That's
governing
the normal
authorities.
Christian American.
Right.
And
Why do you think that is?
They don't know their history.
Okay.
That's what it is, and they're basing their interpretation of what needs to be done in modern times on something that's biblical. And during biblical times, you had kings and emperors.
Right.
And we don't have kings and emperors. And they had absolute power. Well, not even absolute power. For example, the king of Babylon had pretty much absolute power. But when you get to Darius and the whole story of Daniel and the lion's den, he was bound by Persian law.
Right.
And so they tricked him into signing a law that he was then bound by, and so he couldn't deliver Daniel. And so
Speaking of Darius.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so even in the Bible, you have rulers that are subject to law. And I think that most Christians are not thinking in those terms. They don't realize the difference.
Yeah.
And so we don't have a king. We have an executive. And there's a reason that we didn't call him a king. And specifically, they refused to call him a king. And they call it the executive branch. They don't call it the monarchical branch.
Right.
And it was to get away from all that kind of attitude. And so Christians, they don't know how to apply passages to modern times. And so what's supposed to be going on here is you're supposed to take the meaning of the passage, the intent of the passage, and then you apply it to the situation that you're in. And so, what's an easy one? Okay, a woman's not to wear man's clothes, and a man's not to wear women's clothes. Okay, so that's found in the book of Leviticus. And so you have to take that and you have to apply it to modern times. Well, what people do is they'll take and they'll miss the point completely. So, for example, back in the 50s, those were verses that were used to militate against women wearing pants because you're wearing men's clothing, right? And what they're not understanding is that at the time that the passage was written, everybody's wearing dresses.
Right. Yeah.
They're all not. They're not dresses. They're all wearing robes.
Yeah. But if a dude was wearing that today, they could use that verse like you're explaining the people are in the 70s. Right,
yeah. And so if men and women were wearing exactly the same kind of clothing, robes, for example, and you have women's clothing, it's made distinctive by the colors and by the trim and everything that a woman will do. Women put little sparkly things on the backside of their Levi's. Well, I'm never going to wear that, because those are women's Levi's or whatever they are.
Sure.
Whatever the brand name is. When I was in school, they were Jordache, and so I have no idea what they are now. And so there are things that you don't wear, and you got to bring it across into a cultural context. And so you got the same thing with this. Our culture, specifically, our government is a constitutional republic, and so Constitution's king. And so you do that. Okay, now as far as when you're going to disobey the government on these things, when do you want to go to jail? Because that's what's going to happen.
So are you saying wisdom?
Well, I'm going to say, I'm saying, what are you willing to pay to make the statement? What are you willing to do? And because right now we got a bunch of people who are in office, and it's more on one side of the political spectrum than it is on the other side, but it goes across party lines.
Yeah.
Where you got guys who just dismiss the Constitution. They don't even frankly know what it says. I just was watching a news report where somebody who's being interviewed to be a federal judge didn't know what the what Article 4 was about in the Constitution. Didn't know, I think it was Article 2. Didn't know what Article 2 was about in the Constitution. It's just going to be a federal judge and deal with constitutional matters. Well, that's a person who could give a rip about the Constitution.
Yeah, major problem.
Yeah, that's a major problem. And so we've got people in office who are like that right now, but they have the power, and so they can send send the Justice Department after you. And it's one of those things where there's a good chance you may win after you've spent 6 months to a year in jail.
Yeah.
So what are you willing to do? And I think it's coming to the point where I think more and more people are going to be willing to make those kinds of stands, hopefully.
Do you think that after COVID, even after COVID?
Well, I mean, there's some people who are doing it,
Yeah.
and so, I think that what's coming out with COVID, I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, but they keep dribbling out news about the vaccines, and I just read an article this morning about a number of studies that were done on masks, and no effect,
Right.
like no effect, even N95 masks, no effect on as far as mandates go, and whether or not it stopped COVID and that kind of thing. And these are these are rigorous studies. And so when that stuff comes out and enough people hear those things, next time somebody comes up with, let's do a mandate and everybody has to wear a mask, there are going to be a lot more people informed going, yeah, no, shut up, because it's not going to have any kind of effect. And I think that's the case a lot of times with politicians. These guys always overreach, and they always get themselves into a situation where they can propagandize whatever they're doing at the time, and then over time it starts coming out that they were absolutely wrong and messed up on the whole thing. And if enough people are informed on that, then they're not able to do it again. And so hopefully that's what is going on. If we do this again, when we started out with COVID, we kept to some of the mandates that they were doing. Because we didn't know about, what was going to happen and that kind of stuff. Didn't know about mask.
Yeah, we didn't know anything.
Yeah,
at least for the
efficiency
first 2, 3, 4 weeks.
Yeah, and after we found out, then our response was different at that point. And now that all this information's out, if they come up and start mandating this stuff again, I'll just go, no, I'm not going to do it. It's a waste of time, and some of this stuff actually causes harm. So I think it's the same thing with some of this constitutional stuff. I mean, right now, what I know about this is that there are certain areas that we're going to go to, and I talked about this in the prophecy update. Antichrist is not going to have the Second Amendment.
Right.
You're not going to have the First Amendment under the Antichrist kingdom, and so. That's where the world's got to go. But there's some encouraging things. Some of the laws, for example, in New York, which had really stringent Second Amendment laws, have been knocked down by the Supreme Court, and they're playing games with it, trying to get past it, and probably that's going to get knocked down by the Supreme Court. Got some of the same things that are going on in, I believe it's Illinois. It's in Indiana or Illinois. I always get those mixed up. Was it Illinois? Yeah. So they came out with a weapons ban, and that's been knocked down by the courts, and they're trying to find some wiggle room to get done what they want to do, and it looks like it's getting knocked down. But and so that can be encouraging, but I don't know. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, and then the third part of that, which isn't phrased in the question, is that if as a believer, like Daniel, where you're violating your conscience towards God or something that God said, that's a no-brainer. Doesn't matter if you're going to jail or not.
Right. Yeah.
When
we're talking, when they're talking about constitutional issues,
you're thinking of the liberties.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the liberties. And what are you willing to pay to keep your liberties?
Right.
In that instance, when we're talking about biblical issues, absolutely not. Even in the context of Romans 13 or 1 Peter chapter 2, you don't have the liberty to disobey God.
Right, like when the governor says, "Don't worship."
Yeah, and so
which he literally said.
Right, and so as soon as he said that, the answer was stuff it.
Yeah.
And we'll go to court on it or whatever. And or you could try to throw me in jail or that kind of stuff. And so if it's a situation like that, then obviously God comes first. Submission always goes God and then everybody else. And so we submit to God first, and whatever God says about a situation, that's what we're to do, and not playing games with that and using that as a cloak for license, like Peter says. But really, where God says that certain things are supposed to be done, we do those whether or not a government official likes it or not. So,
Right. All right.
yep.